Hello everyone, welcome back. Before we start our class today, I want to go over a few quick announcements. The exam we're gonna open this Friday. It will gonna cover the chapters we've studied so far, including GDP, GDP deflator, inflation, and unemployment, and also business cycles. So please make sure you've gone through like all the materials, including the videos I've uploaded, and review the homework problems before you're actually taking exam. Um, as you know, like the exam will gonna be online, and once you open it, you'll need to complete it in one setting, one sitting, I mean. So try to make sure you are somewhere quiet and have enough time before you begin. Also, I know this is like online class. Please do not try to use any outside sources during the exam. Try to like treat it as same as you would do as in a person exam. All right. Today we're gonna learn about unemployment and then move into business cycles. So let's start. So before we go into details, let's ask one question. Whenever we talk about unemployment, the first question arises over here is actually pretty simple. So who should even be included in the calculation? Who should even be considered when trying to figure out who is employed or unemployed, right? For example, like totals obviously shouldn't count it as unemployed just because they don't have jobs. That makes sense, right? Also, people in military or people who are institutionalized are not going to include it in the standard civilian labor force measure. So here is the thing. Like economists usually begin with something called the working age population. This means that people of ages 16 or older, there is like no maximum age. They are also not in the military or not institutionalized. From there, people can be divided into three groups. So first one is employed people, and second one is unemployed people, and third one is like not in the labor force people. So the first one, like let's go from one by one. So first one was like employed people, right? This includes like paid employees, self-employed workers, unpaid one, and also full-time workers and part-time workers. Second one is unemployed people, and these are the people who are not currently working but willing to work, so are available to work and have actively searched for a job within the last 4 weeks. And the lastly, people not in the labor force. This category includes everyone else. Like for example, like full-time students who are not looking for work, retirees, who else? Like stay-at-home parents or discouraged worker, like all of them like who are not in the labor force, like we're gonna like put like not in the labor force. So, the key formula here is labor force equals employed plus unemployed. So the labor force does not include everyone in the working age populations. It only includes like people who either have jobs or are actively trying to get one. But now, that we know like these all categories, like we can calculate two important labor market statistics, right? The first one is the unemployment rate. This rate tells us what percentage of the labor force is unemployed. So the denominator is not the whole population. Please make sure it is only the labor force. The second measure is the labor force participation rate. And this tells us what percentage of the working age population is actually participating in the labor market. Um, that is, among people old enough to work, like how many are either working or actively looking for work? So here is the easiest way to remember the difference. So the unemployment rate focuses only on the people already in the labor force. But the labor force participation rate, like that compares the labor force to the entire working age population. I added like this diagram because I thought it is cool. This diagram puts all the categories like together very visually, right? At the top, we have like working age population, then that group gets divided into like people in the labor force and people not in the labor force. And inside the labor force, we have employed people and unemployed people. This is why we have to be very careful when interpreting like unemployment statistics, because someone without a job is not automatically counted as unemployed, right? They also have to be actively searching for work by definition. So the unemployment rate is like definitely useful, but it doesn't capture every labor market issue. Just letting you know. All right, let's practice with some actual numbers. We are given three statistics for the US working age population in July 2022. Um, as you can see in the table, there are a number of employed people and unemployed people and also not in the labor force. We're going to calculate labor force, unemployment rate, and working age population, and also labor force participation rate. So for the first, we can start with the labor force. By the definition, it is very easy and simple, direct, just like add up employed and unemployed one, which is like 164 millions people, right? And then now we can actually calculate unemployment rate, which is unemployed divided by labor force. And as we calculated labor force before, so we just like divide 5.7 million people by 164 million people. What and also multiply by like 100, which is like 3.5%. So among people in the labor force, about like 3.5% were unemployed. And please make sure we are not dividing by the entire working age population, right? Now, let's calculate the working age population. Um, The working age population includes both people in the labor force and people not in the labor force as well. So we add like 164 million and 100.1 million, which gives us 264.1 million. This is like kind of like the broader number, and we use this like when calculating the labor force participation rate. Finally, let's calculate the labor force participation rate. Um, like just try to remember, like the formula over there. The formula was labor force divided by working age population multiplied by 100. So we take 164 divided by 264.1 and multiply by 100. That gives us about like 62.1%. So roughly 62% of working age population was either employed or actively looking for work. So this graph shows how the unemployment rate changes over time. The shaded areas represent recession, and during the recession, unemployment usually rises because films like kind of like cut their productions and sometimes lay off workers or like slow down hiring. And you can see that unemployment doesn't always stay constant. Sometimes it is relatively low, and sometimes it jumps pretty sharply. So, a really clear example is the COVID shutdown period when unemployment increased like very quickly because many businesses suddenly closed or reduced like their operations. So, big takeaway here is that the unemployment is closely tied to overall economic conditions. So, yeah, that is, like when the economy weakens, unemployment tends to rise. And when the economy grows, like unemployment usually falls. Now let's connect unemployment to the labor market itself. So in the labor market, workers supply labor, right? And firms demand labor. So workers supply labor because they want wages and also income. The labor supply curves slopes like upward, meaning that the higher wages encourage more people to work or work more hours. On the other end, films demand labor because they need workers to produce like goods and services. The labor demand curve slopes downward, meaning that higher wages making hiring more expensive. So films will not gonna hire that much of like workers as before. And equilibrium happens where the labor supply equals to labor demand. And at the equilibrium wage, the number of like workers films want to hire that matches with the number of like workers who wants a job. So in this simple model, there is like no unemployment caused by wages being too high because like we call it as like, equilibrium. But just like letting you know, but of course, in the real world, wages like do not always adjust like perfectly. So like the unemployment can happen for several different reasons. So now, so now let's talk about different types of like unemployment. First, natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate is basically the normal level of like unemployment that exists like even when the economy is like doing pretty well. So unemployment is usually not zero. That is because people are constantly changing their jobs, entering the like workforce, or sometimes like like dealing with mismatches in the labor market. So the natural rate excludes like cyclical unemployment, which is unemployment caused by ups and downs in the business cycles. That is the reason like they are kind of like really, you know, relative. So like cyclical unemployment rises during the recession and falls like during the expansions. For example, like if the economy enters a recession and film starts like yeah, laying off workers, that will gonna increase in unemployment, and we're gonna call it as like cyclical unemployment. So, like, you can think of like natural unemployment as a kind of like normal background level, but cyclical unemployment comes from like, like short-run economics downturns. Also, there are two major types of like unemployment that make up the like natural rate, which is like frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So frictional unemployment happens because people are finding their job. That kind of like stuff takes time, right? So workers need time to like search for jobs that fit their skills, like interest, like locations, or even the wage, right? So films also need time to, like find it like suitable workers as well. So this type of like unemployment is like usually very temporary. For example, like, let's say there is a student who just graduated and is looking for their first job. Probably they would be, like frictionally unemployed. On the other hand, structural unemployment is quite different. It happens like when there simply are not enough jobs, you know, in certain labor markets. So this can happen because of like institutional or like governmental or like technological changes. Like for example, let's think of like minimum wage laws or unions and efficiency wages. Like we're gonna talk about this like a little bit more like after this. But like those can keep wages above like equilibrium and that kind of stuff will gonna like cause like structural unemployment. So like this type of like structural unemployment tends to last longer because like workers may need retraining or relocation or like sometimes entirely new schools. So this graph shows like how structural unemployment can occur. So if the wages are, like above the equilibrium wage, which is like over here, like the top part, like more workers want their jobs because the wage looks really attractive. But the films want to hire fewer workers because, like that is more expensive, right? So labor supply becomes greater than labor demanded, and that gap is, like structural unemployment. So in this case, like unemployment isn't happening because people are slowly searching for jobs or something. It is happening because, wages are stuck above the level where supply and demand would naturally balance. This can happen because of, like as I talked before, minimum wage laws, union bargaining, or efficiency wages. So the key idea here is pretty straightforward. So when wages stays above the equilibrium, there may be more people wanting their job than there are jobs available. So yeah, there would be some frictions. All right, quick quiz. The question asks like which of the following would mostly likely reduce frictional unemployment? I'm gonna give you like a few seconds. So yeah. So remember that frictional unemployment is mainly about the time it takes workers and firms to find a good matches. So we have to look for something that makes job searching easier or faster. So correct answer should be D. Because if workers and employers can find each other like more quickly through the platforms like, like LinkedIn or something else, that job searching time becomes shorter, right? And since frictional unemployment is really about the search time, so better matching technology probably helps to reduce it. Now let's talk about issues with unemployment rates. The unemployment rates are very useful but it is definitely not perfect. Like nothing is like ever perfect. But yeah, that is because like first, it excludes discouraged workers. These are people who want their job but stop searching because they believe they won't find one. Since they are no longer actively searching, they're counted as not in the labor force instead of like unemployed. And the second one is the unemployment rate doesn't distinguish between full-time and part-time work. This might be a problem. Someone working part-time is still counted as like employed, even if like they desperately want a full-time job. Third one, like some people may inaccurately report their employment status because like this is based on probably survey. So because of like these issues, the unemployment rate may not fully capture underemployment or hidden weakness in the labor market. And that is why economists sometimes use like somewhat broader unemployment measures that include like discouraged workers or, involuntary part-time workers. These slides give us like three major causes of structural unemployment, which is minimum wage laws and unions and efficiency wages. So try to like read it by yourself. Like, yeah, these are very, typical reasons that causes, structural unemployment. All right, let's switch to our second topic, which is business cycles. We already know that like economies tend to grow over the long run, but that growth is not perfectly smooth year after year. That makes sense, right? So sometimes like the economy grows like very quickly, but sometimes growth slows down. Like sometimes like output even first. So like this type of like short run ups and downs are what we call like business cycles. So yeah, as I just said, long run economic growth reflects the growth in the country's like potential output. And potential output here is the amount of output the economy can produce when resources are fully employed. But like as you can think, in the short run, like actual output does not always like matches with the potential output. And sometimes like actual output falls below the potential output, especially during the recessions when resources are unemployed or underused. But also sometimes like actual output rises above like potential output probably during the economic booms, when economy is like kind of like operating very intensively. So a business cycle refers to these short-run fluctuations in economic activity. Basically, like how actual output moves around potential outputs over time. These business cycles kind of like matter because they affect jobs, income, production, and also spending. And even though recessions like eventually ends, like they still can leave long-lasting effects. So people may lose their jobs, businesses may close, households may cut their spending, even for a longer time afterward. Now let's define the output gap. The output gap measures the difference between actual output and potential output as a percentage of like potential output. So there is a formula like actual output minus like potential output divided by potential output multiplied by 100. And if actual output is below the potential output, like we have negative output gap. That means the economy is producing less than it could, which is usually associated with recession or weak economic conditions. Yeah. Then if actual output is above the potential output, of course we're gonna have like a positive output gap, right? And that means the economy is producing above its sustainable level. This can happen during the booms, but it usually can continue like forever, because like resources are kind of like being stretched very heavily, and inflationary pressure may build up on that. So the output gap helps us like see whether the economy is like operating below, near, or above its potential. All right, we're gonna go to define the main stages of business cycles. So a peak is the high point of like economic activity, and true is a low point of economic activity. A recession, we've heard a lot, is a period when economic activities is declining from, yeah, of course, peak to through. An expansion is the period when economic activities is increasing from true to peak. So if you see the graph, you can see the economic falling from the peak down to the true. That is recession phase. And after the true, like output begins rising again, which is expansion phase. So one phase like economists like sometimes use is that expansions do not die of like old age. That means like expansions usually, and because of like some kind of like shock. Maybe, for example, like I can think of like financial crisis, or yeah, of course, pandemic, or an oil shock, or maybe sometimes like even because of the police policy mistake. Yeah. So business cycles are not just like random movements. They are kind of like recurring fluctuations around the economies, like long run, like growth trend. The finer diagram summarizes like the business cycle. So I thought it is cool again. Yeah. The upward sloping line represents potential output, or the economy's like long run productive capacity. And the wavy line represents actual output, which moves above and below the potential output over time. So when actual output is like below potential output, like we have, of course, a negative output gap, usually, associated with recession or weak economic activity. And when actual output is above the like potential output, we have a positive like output gap, and which is usually associated with a boom. We learned like all the like definitions of peak through recession and also expansion. Please try to remember that. And one last important distinction is GDP measures the level of output, right? While GDP growth measures how output changes over time. So when we study business cycles, we care about like both the level of the output and the speed at which output is rising or falling. So, all right, that wraps up like today's class. For the exam, please make sure you're comfortable with the unemployment formulas and different types of like unemployment and the limitations of the unemployment rate and what else. And also keep business cycle terms like peak through, like recession, expansion, and like output gap. Good luck. Thank you.